I guess we shall just start doing that by talking about, let me think. The first one, Lethal Weapon 1. Drew, what's that all about for those who haven't heard of Lethal Weapon?
Yes, the first one because we continue to be groundbreaking mavericks. Mel Gibson was quite the hot young thing in Hollywood once upon a time. Yes, I know, weird, isn't it? Mel Gibson in demand. That largely after the success of the Mad Max trilogy. And actually, he was an excellent choice to play Martin Riggs, the suicidal, burned-out maverick cop who nobody wants to work with. Narrative law, of course, states that such a character cannot be partnered with a similarly minded person because compatibility would be chaos. So he is partnered with 50-year-old conservative by-the-book Sergeant Roger Murtaugh, who is, you may be aware, too old for this. Casting for this character was less obviously apt, with the role going to stage actor Danny Glover, whose last film role prior to Lethal Weapon was as Whoopi Goldberg's abusive husband in Steven Spielberg's The Colour Purple. Director Richard Donner, though, felt he saw something immediately between the duo in casting, and the rest is history. Before I continue to the plot, an aside, a tangent from me, surely not to hear you cry. Also, a tangent on a tangent, I cannot actually say me questioningly without immediately thinking, a governor? But that's a deeper rabbit hole to go down. Yes, as an aside, Lethal Weapon is that rarest of things. A film where the actors are cast substantially younger than their roles. Poor old Danny Glover, who in fact wasn't poor old Danny Glover, despite his age being a running joke throughout the series, who was a mere 40 when first playing the 50-year-old Murtaugh, and Mel Gibson himself only 31. Though Riggsy's age, never stated, seems to stretch to whatever works for any given scene. If Riggs was the same age as Gibson, then he was meeting Special Forces soldiers in Saigon at the tender age of 13. Not for the first time, though. I may be overthinking things. So, the plot. Well, as this is an 80s action movie, the plot is not of the most complex variety. A young woman takes one last long step off of a high balcony and rather makes a mess of the car right below her. What seemed like a consequence of the drugs she was taking soon turns out to be more sinister. Her death was both a murder and a warning. The recipient of that warning is her father, an old Vietnam buddy of Murtaugh's, whose bank is a useful front for laundering the cash of a group of former soldiers and CIA agents who are now in the heroin business. At the beginning of this investigation, Sergeant Murtaugh is paired with a new partner, a frazzled vice detective called Martin Riggs, who thinks about suicide every night after the recent death of his wife of 11 years. Not an impossible number, again 11 years and somebody who's 31, but most dates and times with Riggs seem to come from a random number generator. They're like chalk and cheese, so laws of narrative causality tell us that they'll be best friends by the end of the film. Their investigation takes them into danger several times, during which they bond become best friends. See? Told you. That investigation doesn't merit much of a recap, mostly involving, as it does, car chases, violence, explosions, and Gary Busey as the super creepy Mr. Joshua, the outfit's lead enforcer. Sadly, Riggs and Murtaugh could have saved themselves a great deal of trouble in this film, and all of the subsequent ones, if they'd first investigated whoever it is in the clearly corrupt LAPD that keeps telling the bad guys where officers are working, on which cases they're working, and numerous times where they live. But I, not for the first time, digress. Writer Shane Black's original draft, which he himself hated, featured a conclusion in which a truck full of cocaine would explode over the Hollywood Hills, with the white powder then snowing on the Hollywood sign, which is, I think, a strong contender for the most 80s thing I have ever heard. To be fair, it's not actually any dafter than the real ending of Lethal Weapon, in which Riggs and Mr. Joshua are allowed to fight, surrounded by police officers, in potentially lethal unarmed combat on Roger's lawn for reasons? But I admire the restraint. Talking of Murtaugh's home, though, and the myriad calamities that occur there in this film and its sequels, I consider it a great failing of the series that it failed to even pay lip service to the fact that the Murtaughs must be the most hated neighbours anywhere in California. Shocking. Nearly 35 years on, it's good to know that Lethal Weapon still stands up. It's a great deal of fun, even when my tolerance for its particular brand of action is not what it once was. When I am, well, very, very much over cars made out of nitroglycerin, or whatever it was they were seemingly filled with in the 80s. The bulk of that has much to do with Glover and Gibson. Gibson is particularly good as the emotionally troubled young officer, but Glover balances them well with his calmness, and the duo just work well together, and both have a lot of charisma. There are other smaller factors too. Roger's family feels like a real family, something that's surprisingly rare in a lot of films. The atmosphere in the police station feels relaxed and fraternal without being too macho. The presence of the saxophone isn't immediately hateful. To address this last point, I actually even like the presence of the saxophone here, which is a weird thing for me to be saying, even if this use has become a joke over time. Used it as for comedy stings, and being blissfully absent from most of the rest of the string-heavy score. You better get used to that score though, as it's the same one you're going to be hearing for the next 3 films too, by which time you'll be A, utterly sick of it, particularly the bits that sound 95% identical to really notable moments in Die Hard, and B, have realised that composer Michael Kamen has one score, and there's less or no Eric Clapton in later films to bail him out. Lethal Weapon is really solid fun, and where it's let down nowadays is the unnecessary instances of racism and particularly homophobia. These are things that recur through the series, and by the standards of the time and the genre, they're not actually so bad nor so common as you might expect, and just makes them stand out more. And of course, such things tend to have a little extra something now if they're being delivered by all male. But I wouldn't let that put you off watching Lethal Weapon if you've never seen it. And I've somehow achieved not seeing Lethal Weapon.
Yeah, I suppose I have to preface any discussion of Lethal Weapon by saying that I did really enjoy my time with it again. I haven't seen this in an awful long time because, well, you kind of don't need to.
Yeah.
It's something that's going to be ingrained upon us.
It's something of a standard, isn't it?
Yeah. Even just bearing that in mind, when I was watching it this time, having been familiar with it over the years, it's kind of cast in a different light, as most cop dramas are by recent events, shall we say. I was thinking that, this is pretty much the canonical example of the buddy cop genre of films as it is. This is often imitated and never bettered. It is a really solid film for all the reasons you mentioned. It's a tremendous double act. It really is great and very enjoyable to watch. But it's not all that long ago. We're just talking still in the slightly pre-war era, where the thought of a drama where police were helping you would have been laughable. That's why there was so many, anything an investigation had private eyes in it. That's Humphrey Bogart's career. Because the police were so horrendously corrupt in modern society that you could not have contemplated them being dependable for any kind of investigation whatsoever.
Particularly in that police department.
Exactly what I was going with. And the PR push that the police departments of the world, particularly LAPD, managed to do between the, buddy cops stuff started appearing, in the 70s, maybe, something like that, and it was pushed through. This is kind of I would say Lethal Weapon is probably the culmination of all that and kind of the peak example of it. But yeah, for understandable reasons, because policemen can, there's a lot of dramatic shortcuts you can take that you wouldn't need to if you're doing any other kind of drama, and that's helpful if you're doing this kind of thing. But the way that it became so ingrained as being good guys in the dramatic sphere, while at the same time still being grossly institutionally racist, particularly at the time this was being made, really is quite an interesting contrast. And it's not something that's kind of really got any better throughout the years, as we've seen, and with all the recent protests going on, and even what we've seen in the UK recently with our protests about the bill to stop protests, and people being beaten up as that, which is not great optics. So yeah, all that kind of stuff was playing on my mind when I was watching it again, and it really got in the way of what was otherwise a very uncomplicated and very interesting, very fun film to watch. So it takes a bit of... I know you kind of touched upon other instances, racism and homophobia and all that kind of stuff that will go through it, which is just kind of sadly taken as kind of par for the course for this kind of thing.
It's not specific to this film at all, unfortunately. It's the time and the genre in particular, and it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. and a bit of trepidation going back to this for those reasons.
Yeah.
But just they do stick out, and it's like it's because it's so unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's because it's so casual, and that's what bothers me. It's just people were just asshats.
Yeah, yeah, they definitely weren't thinking of. I'm entirely on board with political correctness. I don't care what anyone else says. Yeah, but again, you have to make a little bit of adaptation for the time that this came in, and if you do that, then yes, Lethal Weapon stands up incredibly well. It's a really good action film. It has a great central chemistry between the two leads. Shane Black's script is witty, it's clever, it's frequently very funny, and as you mentioned, has quite a lot of characterization and fairly believable, deep characterization for characters, which you would not necessarily expect from this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you probably won't get from the rest of the series. But this is clearly the high point of it, and it's really good. It is a terrific film to revisit, and I heartily enjoyed my time with it. Again, yes, it is a bit of an artifact of the era, but yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think it's still a really, really solid film. It's the archetype of the genre. It's been, and there are other films around that time, kind of like 48 Hours, another 48 Hours, back when Nick Nolte was understandable.
Yeah, and less pussy-ish. Yeah,
I guess Stakeout as well. It's kind of calling. I think another 48 Hours came before this, I think, but Stakeout was more just kind of trying to ape it. And obviously, the culmination of this is Shane Black returning to this very genre in The Nice Guys, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
It still stands up. And here's the thing, you watch this, and for all the problems of potentially separating the art from the artist and things, and how generally unpleasant a person Mel Gibson has turned out to be, there was a reason he was a big star. He's a good actor. He's really watchable. He's got heaps of charisma. And this film is one of the ones that really showcased it, because Mad Max was a cult film, basically.
Yeah.
And most Americans don't even know there was one. The one they're familiar with, Mad Max 2, that was known as the Road Warrior there. Like, they weren't aware that was the second film at all, for the most part. But it's a cult film, and Max Rokitansky's a fairly blank character.
Yeah.
He's kind of just like the human littlest hobo. He's the wandering and stuff's happening around him. He's the focus of it. But somebody obviously saw something in him at the time, gave him this, and that started a great career of a lot of performances that I've really liked. And it's like, why did he turn it to such an asshat? Why did he ruin things? But he's still perfectly watchable in this, more than perfectly watchable. So yeah, I don't think you should let him being a jackass nowadays, so it's a jackass then, just didn't know it, put you off of watching this, what's a real classic of the action comedy genre. Oh
yes, and cinema on all sides of the camera is filled with innumerable jackasses, which if we start discounting, then we'll never see anything again. And there's an awful lot of other people working on these kind of things that made such a good film between Shane Black and even Richard Donner's direction is punchy and pacey and keeps everything moving really tightly. All the comic beats are delivered really well. It is not saying anything particularly original to say that this is the pinnacle of the buddy cop genre, and it is for all those reasons. It's just really good.